Thank you, everyone. Thank you. You don't have a seat already. Just find your way. I think we're missing a couple people from last week, but that's fine. I'm sure they're just stragglers. Can everyone see that? Okay? We're good? Perfect. So yes, Nelly's rise to the top. This will be quite an action-packed class compared to the last one. It was a lot of logistics. I understand it may have been a bit boring, but this is what we call the good stuff. I don't know if you would normally refer to it as the good stuff with all things considered surrounding Nelly and her tyrannical reign, but this is probably the most action-packed you're going to get in this course. And the most interesting thing is that all of these events we're about to cover really are unpacked over a 6-month period. Very short, very quick, but very, very significant, and a lot happened in that time. This will also be very important for the midterms. There's a lot of crucial information on here, so not everything is useful, but just keep that in mind. So just a little recap. As we all remember, in our last class, we spoke a little bit about Reagan and his issues with how things were being run at Burger Beast. He was not having a good time when it came to balancing power with back of house. He also had general issues with Allan and the overall estate of the financials and the specifics when it came to ordering and very small, minor details surrounding the logistics of the restaurant. But these small, minor problems soon erupted into an explosion, which culminated in the loss of Reagan. Reagan was brought into the office of Allan, where Allan sat him down, and Allan famously did not fire Reagan. That was actually a story that was fabricated by Nelly later on in her reign in an attempt to appease the masses and paint Reagan in a better light, but that's just not true. Reagan was almost completely set on quitting up until that very moment. Allan, in fact, wanted him to stay and had given him proper reason to stay, in essence. But Reagan wanted nothing to do with that. Reagan was fed up and had heard enough and decided that it was his time to leave. So the meeting did not go well. Reagan walked out the door, not even giving his 2 weeks' notice, and just like that, there was no manager in the entire restaurant. And this led to a scramble, really, because now back of house ran the entire restaurant. They were the only ones with proper administrative staff, such as the kitchen manager, Paula, and the assistant kitchen manager, Rahul. So they really had all the say when it came to the administrative decisions in the restaurant, when it came to ordering, when it came to the menu. And this wasn't necessarily a good thing in the moment, because it was a lot more responsibility that was being dumped on their plate. They already had to manage back of house, remember. But to them it was good, because it meant that they essentially had sole control over everyone, back of house and front of house included, which meant that for the first time since the walls were painted that ugly shade of lime green, both front of house and back of house were united under one front, that being Paula and Rahul as her right-hand man. To make matters worse, Allan did not just need to look for a front-of-house manager, which was already proving difficult, as many people who did apply did not meet the same standards or expectations that he had set out, but now he also needed to fill in the open spots that were opening up at a scary rate. First starting with Scotty, and then Dennis following shortly after, both of whom, if you remember, were Reagan's recommendations. They were longtime friends of his, but then after his departure from the company, they decided they didn't really want to work there anymore, as many would probably have the same thought. Now, Scott and Dennis did stay around for a little bit, but the straw that broke the camel's back was really Paula and Rahul and their authoritative, very strict authoritative stance over front of house. See, they kind of had an agreement with Reagan. They had a good thing going with their hours. Scotty wanted Saturdays off so he can go to the club, and Dennis wanted Sundays off to go to church. And that was something that was easily manageable with Reagan in power. But now that Paula and Rahul were here, they really wanted nothing to do with that. They weren't too keen on availability and having a flexible schedule. So they kicked that idea straight to the curb. And so as a result, Scott and Dennis departed afterwards as well. And that we will talk more on soon. But that just kind of paints a picture for you that Allan was stretched a little bit thin. He really needed someone quick. He really needed a good candidate to take over and fill in the shoes of Reagan. But that would prove difficult. Except he did have someone in mind, that being Nelly. Nelly really was the perfect candidate for general manager. You could not have a better individual for the role. She was a hard worker. She had a great record when it came to punctuality, never being late to a single shift in her 4 years of working at the restaurant. She had even taken up many administrative roles, having never been a supervisor or a manager of any kind. She was a regular server, and she was already taking part in the ordering of certain products to the restaurant and aiding in certain customer service issues. So really, she was already in a role that was easily transferable to a general manager position. So it seemed only fit that she would be the one to step up. And Paula and Rahul had even prepared for this. Nearly everyone in the restaurant had expected her to take the reins after Reagan had left. But famously, she declined the position of general manager. I actually skipped over a point here. I just realized I included a quote from Sam Kroner's Before Burgers Killed, a reading which I will attach in the description for this online video. What do you call it? Like an online upload? I don't know. It'll be in the link below. It's a great read, and I think it will definitely help you with your exams at the end of the year. So it's not mandatory, but it's highly recommended. So definitely check it out. It'll just be a quick blurb. But this is actually taken from one of the pages. And the quote is, "Nelly always walked in with a smile and out with a smile." Just a little short snippet that kind of really sums up her positive attitude, how she had a good relationship, not only with the front of house, but also with back of house, as this quote was taken from Kareem, who worked as a line cook at Burger Beast. So clearly she had a good rapport with both servers and cooks alike, which made her even a bigger threat in the eyes of Paula and Rahul. But as I said, she declined the position of general manager, which was a shock to many. And here we have the text messages that were sent between Allan and Nelly. Excuse me. And yes, this just kind of highlights again, her and Allan also had a very good relationship. Allan was always fond of her. He probably would have promoted her to the position sooner, or had her be general manager instead of Reagan, had she been at the restaurant at the right time, or had he known her for a longer period of time. Allan was known to not trust people very well, which is part of the reason why he had trouble finding general manager candidates, because he was a bit too strict, a bit too specific, and he never quite, felt comfortable giving someone that job. He really wanted to give it to someone he knew already, which is why he was so keen on Nelly, and he was upset when she denied the role. But overall, he understood, because again, they were on good terms, the two of them. And because of this, as I said before, this was really the reign of Paula and Rahul. With no general manager in sight, Allan had to step in as the interim manager, taking on the role just temporarily, but it was really a formality. Allan did not participate in the orderings, in making the schedules, in the payroll and whatnot. Allan was busy trying to expand the restaurant, doing things that were on the outside of the business. For everything inside the restaurant, that really was Paula and Rahul's job, and they took it seriously. They were given schedule privileges, which was a huge, huge deal. Before, it was Reagan who made the front of house schedule and Paula and Rahul who would make the back of house schedule, but now it was the entire restaurant, which gave them a significant amount of influence and sway over everybody who worked there. And as I mentioned before, there was also the added responsibilities of ordering and whatnot. I feel like I've already spoken on that quite a bit. So now, in their new position of power, they really wanted to reinforce it. They didn't want anybody coming after them. They didn't want to have to be looking over their shoulders every 5 minutes. And they were really worried about Nelly. They thought that she would be the one to do it, so they were really, gunning for her in the days prior to Allan asking Nelly if she would be general manager. They were keeping a close eye, but then after her denial of the role, they sort of backed away from her, and instead they decided to focus on Chris, who really was, in everyone's eyes, the second in line to the role of general manager. We'll speak a little bit more on Chris in a second, but again, very strong worker and had a fairly good rapport with people in the restaurant. Again, he was like Nelly, but just a bit absent-minded in certain situations. Again, I'll speak more on that in a second. But with Nelly out of the picture, seemingly, they expected him to be the next one. So they set their targets on Chris, thinking that he would be the one to come after them and attempt to destabilize their rule over the restaurant. And Nelly, as a result, was able to stay under the radar. Now, this is one of the things that, I have to be very careful when I talk about Nelly, because we all know what she would go on to do with her exorbitant amount of power. But it's moments like these where you almost have to admire her tactics. And we're going to speak on that on this next slide. But this is, a glimpse into who she was, because she was very subtle with how she eventually rose to the top. She could have accepted the general manager role. It was right there, right for the taking, but she didn't. And it proved to be an incredible move on her part, because if she had, again, Paula and Rahul expected this, and they were ready for it. They were prepared to attack and to defame her in any way to, make the workers at Burger Beast despise her and not want to follow under her rule. But because she denied the role, she sort of took a back seat, and she faded into this place of, she faded into a place where she appeared non-threatening. She was no longer on the main stage, and so everyone's eyes were on Paula and Rahul. And this gave her a chance to work from the shadows, as it were, and really create a foundation, an iron foundation, really, that would hold her up in her upcoming reign. So I'd already spoken on this a little bit previously, but the front of house at this point was just staying afloat, and barely at that rate. It became a serious issue in late May of 2025. They'd already lost Scott and Dennis, but in the month following it, there were also another 2 departures. They were 2 of the probationers who were servers at the time. They had 2 quarrels with customers. They had very poor customer service skills, and as a result, they also quit. They didn't want to have to deal with the expectations of Burger Beast, and that led the front of house side of the restaurant having only 4 members, 4 in total, which for even a small restaurant like that is unheard of. At its height, when the walls were painted lime green, the restaurant had 9 front of house members. 9. So they had more than halved that former amount. So you can imagine things were getting extremely tense for front of house. There was an increase in hours. The staff was just being spread thin in general. The pay was good. The pay could be appreciated, but a lot of the members of front of house, you have to remember this wasn't their total vocation. They didn't want to spend their entire lives at Burger Beast. They had things outside of the restaurant, so none were too happy about these raises in the hours, even if it meant more pay. So they were spread thin, and it was clear that front of house needed new staff. And oddly enough, Paul and Rahul did not have any front of house recommendations, which, let's be clear, they definitely did. They most certainly knew people. Paul and Rahul had been working in the service industry for years before this. Paula especially. Paula, who was around 62, I can't remember her exact age at the moment, my apologies, but at this moment in time she was definitely in her 60s, so you can imagine she has 30 years of restaurant experience. And so for her to look at Allan in the face and say that she did not know anyone who could come in and fill in these gaps in the front of house, it's a wonder to me how Allan did not, laugh right then and there. Of course she knew people, but the reason she didn't recommend them was because she had front of house exactly where she wanted them. When they were weak, when they were divided, not as easily able to be organized. This was perfect. This was what Paula had been working for the last 2 years since she had first joined Burger Beast again. She had the opportunity to hold an iron fist over both sides of the restaurant. And so by keeping front of house in this kind of weak state, she had the idea that it would enforce her rule, but it's debatable because this also just sort of made front of house more irritated with her. And it makes me wonder if maybe she had taken a different approach. If she had made her own recommendations, if she had gone some of her own people who she could trust, and put them on front of house, maybe it would have been far more advantageous for her. Maybe she would have been able to keep a better control over both sides of the restaurant. And so without her recommendations, either from Paula or Rahul, without anyone coming in, the Burger Beast essentially fell into the lowest point of its history. The only other time that it had been this desperate was when the 2x4 had come through the window just 2 summers previously. That, to them, was their darkest of dark periods, and now they were approaching a new one, and no one was happy about it. This is actually the slide I was talking about. This is where we will discuss a little bit more about Nelly's tactics. So, as we have mentioned before in other classes, Nelly was an alumni of Darcy Art School, which, even to this day is one of the leading producers of servers. If you go to a fine dining restaurant, some of the greatest waiters you'll ever see have gone to this art school, getting various degrees in acting or filmmaking, creative writing, poetry, dance, you name it. So, being an alumni of this school, she had many people who she could bring in. And soon that's exactly what she did. Nelly's friends eventually swelled the ranks, with the first being Lucy Wells, who she also did sort of under the radar. She spoke mostly with Allan, refusing to go through Paul and Rahul, which was smart on her part, as she didn't want them to figure it out. But the funny thing is that she didn't actually keep a very good secret about it. Paul and Rahul did know that it was one of her friends. They just did not expect her to know as many people as she did. They thought that maybe Lucy Wells would be the only person that she would recommend, and they figured it was not a threat that they needed to pay any mind to. But then Oliver Simpa was the second one to join the ranks, and this one Nelly was a little bit more careful about. She did it under the guise of the Schuster Street Festival, which happened later on that May, and for those who don't know, the Schuster Street Festival was always a busy time, not only for Burger Beast, but for every other store that was on King Street at the time. It became a hot spot. The roads were shut down, so there were no cars, no streetcars, no nothing. It was just people. Floods and floods of people, of tourists, walking up and down, looking for places to eat, for things to buy, and Burger Beast was always a standout. So when it came to the Schuster Street Festival, it was all hands on deck. And there was really no breathing room. It was from open to close, completely packed at all times. So under that, in this chaos, the kitchen really didn't notice any new, front of house recruits. They eventually noticed Oliver Simpa, but they just assumed that he was a hire from Allan himself. They had no idea that he had any connection whatsoever to Nelly. So she had very cleverly sneaked in 2 of her close friends into the ranks at front of house. And this is where she really shines, because it shows you that she was very similar to Reagan, but tactically latent. That's how I like to describe her, tactically latent. She possessed the skill. She possessed the necessary requirements to be a good leader, and she knew she did. But she knew that she couldn't show her full hand, so to speak. Some of the key things that I always notice when I research about her is she moved when the restaurant moved. And this helped her kind of keep her goals on the down low. Reagan, if you remember, Reagan brought Scotty and Dennis into the ranks of front of house because he felt threatened. Because Paula and Rahul were already encroaching on his responsibilities. They had offered to place orders and offered to help with the schedule, and he felt very threatened by this. And so he brought on two of his friends, and he openly admitted this too, in an attempt to stabilize his reign and to give him more influence on front of house and gain him the numbers to fight back against back of house. It was blatant, it was overt, and back of house knew this. And this is where Nelly is the exact opposite, because she did not make her moves open to everyone. You know, she recognized that the restaurant was in need of front of house staff. She waited until that moment when they were desperate for new hires, and only then did she bring in the people she knew. Because then, if someone were to come up and say, well, you only did that to strengthen your influence, she could say, no, I did it because we needed people, and we were extremely desperate. She also showed an indifference to power, and that was clearly shown in her denial of the role of general manager. She created this ruse that she had no interest whatsoever in having an administrative position, that she was completely happy with her role as a server, even though she had already, made huge moves when it came to, or not huge moves, my apologies, more, she had already taken on many responsibilities that some would think a person with a higher role than just a waiter would have. But despite this, she showed no signs of wanting anything other than her current position. She was happy being a waiter. She was happy with her current pay. And not at any point before this did she ever express any intention of wanting a higher position. And so this was very important for her because, again, it just did not make her appear to be a threat to the individuals who were looking for threats, i.e. Paula and Rahul. It also helped immensely that she was such a neutral employee. As I said, she had a great rapport with both back of house and front of house, to the point where she was, she would often hang out with kitchen staff outside of work in the same way that she would hang out with front of house staff outside of work, which was really unheard of in that time. There was a great divide between the two sides, and people sensed that she might be the one to bridge the gap between the two. But for now, at this point in time, everyone just thought of her as very likable, very charismatic, and never tried to villainize back of house or front of house for any sort of issue. She was very careful to kind of stay out of the spats that would happen between either side, making sure to keep herself sort of out of conflict and essentially keep herself as a blank slate so that when the time came, people would maybe trust her a bit more. Because without playing her full hand, so to speak, she seems a little bit more idyllic in certain ways. And her recommendations were just better. Scott and Dennis clearly were not great fits for the restaurant. They were there for only 3 months, and they did not get along with back of house or front of house. No one really respected their work ethic. They didn't think that they had enough hustle, and they didn't have the same impact that Lucy Wells and Oliver Simpa eventually did, and that is really all thanks to their career up until that point. They had plenty of experience when it came to serving. They had served at such places as the John Tavern, which on Friday nights, if you've read anything about the tavern, it can get hellish, and really there's no room to even pause and think. It's sort of it can get to a point it got to a point really when it was still open that servers just had to rely on muscle memory to get through a night. And Lucy and Oliver survived many of those Friday nights. So with achievements like that under their belt, you can imagine they came in to Burger Beast and they kind of had a sigh of relief because it was so much easier. And they were able to, really use the skills that they hone to make a good impact on a restaurant that needed it desperately. And you can tell that all of this was intentional on the side of Nelly, that her becoming general manager in the near future, it was not a fluke. And that her denial of it was not earnest either. You know, we can admit that. We can fully look at the records and know for a fact that Nelly had every intention of gunning for power. If you look at her diary, I included a quote from it as well. She wrote in her diary that, I'm willing to put on whatever face I need to convince whoever it may be that I can get to wherever I please. So it was a ruse. It was just a very clever ruse. She knew how she had to act to get what she needed. She knew when to bring in people when they needed to be brought in. She knew what times were best to move and what times were the worst. She was very intelligent when it came to that kind of stuff. And it was one of the main reasons why she came to power in the near future. So, now with growing influence, there was a bit more talk about Nelly. She was now kind of being pushed back into the limelight. And this was becoming a bit of an issue because Paul and Rahul were starting to have differing opinions on her. Not too differently, but enough that it was a bit concerning for Paula, who kind of started to think, okay, maybe I'm on shaky ground here. Rahul, like many others in the back of house, had a respect for Nelly. He really respected how she brought front of house together, how she would rally them up on busy nights, how she took the reins even when she didn't have to, how she denied a position of leadership but still acted as one when it was necessary. He had a great respect for her, and there's some evidence to suggest that there may have been a romantic relationship between the two, which also might have added fuel to the fire. During the night of the reservation that never left, Paula and Rahul and Nelly, my apologies, were the last two to leave. I believe Kareem was the last person to see them. They were the only two in the restaurant, and later that night, around 3 or 4 in the morning, Allan had received a notice that the motion detectors were picking up movement in the restaurant. And the very next morning, Rahul showed up to work, and he was described as being very tired, but very cheerful, very, uncharacteristically happy. And this is all conjecture, really. There's no way of proving. Nelly never writes about it in her diary, although, from what we can gather about Nelly and who she was, it doesn't seem like something that she would write down. If they did have some kind of romantic relationship, it wasn't something that was too strong. It may have just been a one-time thing. But regardless, there's no evidence to suggest that this even occurred. It's just a theory, but it would explain maybe why Rahul was a bit hesitant about going after her and following Paula's lead on that. And Paula really held the power to block Nelly's path to general manager, if that path even existed. Because again, they weren't too sure. She had that guise of neutrality. So they really weren't sure if she wanted that position or if they were supposed to be paying attention to Chris. Again, it was a genius move on Nelly's part because they were just split down the middle. They had no idea if they were supposed to focus on Chris, who was the big target, or if they were to focus on her. She scrambled them, essentially, with that confusion. It was a great move. But Paula held the power, and it was really up to her to try and figure out, okay, what can I do to prove that Nelly is not fit for this role? How can I prove to Allan that she cannot be the next general manager? And to make it even more difficult, Allan was away from April until June of 2025, so he was not even in the restaurant. He was out of the province, looking for other places to expand Burger Beast into. So there was no really direct contact with him. There was text messages and emails, but Allan was not the best when it came to those kinds of mediums. So it was really only a matter of time until evidence was found. Paula was, very tenacious. She would not give up. She had a persistence to try and figure out a way to, stop Chris or Nelly from getting to the top. It was just difficult to get that evidence to Allan when the time came. And so really that's why there was such a big gap, really, of events between April and June. It was almost like a Cold War. Both sides sort of knew something was about to happen, but until Allan was in the restaurant, there really wasn't anything tangible. There wasn't really a tangible step that they could take. And so it kind of led to a little bit of inactivity until Curtis and his request for a pay raise, a very important event for the history of Burgerby's. Or I suppose the history of Nelly's reign over Burgerby's, as this would prove to be kind of her first step in getting to the role of general manager. It was one of the most debilitating events in back-of-house history, ever since the 2x4 came in through the window, obviously. Curtis came in and demanded a $5 raise. $5. Now, he was already being paid $21 an hour, and he was a very valued employee. He had been working with the company for a very long time. He was very good at his job. He had a very good relationship with pretty much all of the staff. He was very similar to Nelly in that regard. So a pay raise was not out of the question, but $5 was absolutely ridiculous. I don't think there's a kitchen manager out there today even that would, even try and accept that or try and make that work. It's an extreme jump from 21 to 25, even for the state in which he worked at. So there was a counter offer. Paula and Rahul offered to pay him $23 an hour instead, and they figured that's probably a good medium. It's about half of what he had asked for, and considering that his first offer was pretty hysterical, they thought it was actually generous of them to even entertain a counteroffer. But Curtis was, suspiciously fickle and brutally honest, really. It led, after receiving this counteroffer, he became extremely angry and had an outburst in the view of not only the dining area, but just everyone in the kitchen. Everyone had heard his outburst. And in this outburst, he essentially unpacked everything that he disliked about Paula and Rahul, claiming them to be very selfish in their position, not giving people the time off that they ask for, giving certain people hours over others, and it was a very strange sight because Curtis was not one to confront people. He was very bashful, not really wanting to pick fights with anybody. But this time he did, and after he had said what he needed to say, he simply gathered his things and walked out of the restaurant. And remember, this was a Saturday. Now, it was the morning, but, they would need to find a replacement before Saturday night, and lo and behold, they couldn't. So they were down a man for a busy Saturday night. Now, Paul and Rahul were not initially worried about this. They figured, okay, we're down one person. We've been in worse situations before. I'm sure it's fine. That was what they were thinking. What they failed to sort of put together was the fact that in all of those situations that they were thinking of from the past, Curtis had always been there. And they did not catch the fact that Curtis was an anchor in the kitchen. If you examine his positioning in the kitchen, you'll see how much of an important asset he was to them. He was wedged right between Jacob and Khalid, and that prevented the two of them from talking to one another. They were known to be incessant talkers. One of them always had a story, whatnot, or gossip, or whatever. And whenever the two of them were next to each other, they would just talk and not get any work done. But with his placement there, it stopped them from communicating directly with one another, and it made them more focused. Plus, with Curtis's height from where he was able to see over the ovens and get a look at takeout. And he was able to tell whether or not they were getting slammed, if they were getting a lot of orders. So he was able to warn the kitchen in advance if they were about to get, an influx of takeout orders. The last point that made him such a strong individual in the kitchen was his strong bladder. It's a little funny to talk about, but he did. He did have a very strong bladder. Most people in the kitchen would take, a couple bathroom breaks in a single night, especially if they're working from opening to close. But Curtis had the reputation of never taking bathroom breaks while he was at work. In fact, he openly stated that it made him feel uncomfortable to use the bathroom at work. And so that made him a huge asset, because when people would leave to use the bathroom, they knew that they always had at least someone who was very strong in what they did in the kitchen at all times, someone who did not need a break at any given point, which was key for a Saturday night. So, failing to realize that Curtis was an anchor, the kitchen fell into disarray. There were missed orders, takeout had to be closed entirely, which had only happened 4 times before. And so for it to happen now, it was huge. So huge that Allan, who was overseas at this point, had heard about it and had some extremely, vile things to say to Paul and Rahul in return. But again, they had no choice. Without Curtis there, it was just chaos. They had no way of keeping up with the busyness that Saturday brings. Oh, and I almost forgot, an allergen was nearly missed on a dish, and this was a peanut allergy, an anaphylactic peanut allergy. Had that dish gone out, who knows what might have happened. That might have been detrimental to even Nelly as well. The whole restaurant might have been shut down. And this was all as a result of a singular person not being present for their shift. That person being Curtis. So, although the financial loss was already great, it was really the embarrassment that hurt the most. Burger Beast had such a good reputation as being a very well-organized, a well-run establishment, and this Saturday threw that reputation right into the trash. There were online reviews that were horrible. People had left feeling dissatisfied. It was a devastating blow to Burger Beast as a whole. And again, Allan was not happy about it whatsoever. And Curtis, who had walked out that same day, never came back. So now, not only were front of house still recovering from their employment struggle, but now back of house had their own. And so they now had to scramble for their own replacement, which would prove to be an advantage for Nelly, as it was a good and needed distraction for 2 of her, notorious enemies in back of house. So still speaking on Curtis's, the whole situation that unfolded with Curtis in his absence, again, no one could have known until that night just how vital Curtis was to the team. It was only afterwards that they realized that he was a crucial member of the team, and they were really able to put together the pieces and discover everything that I mentioned before about his strategic placing in the kitchen. So again, none of this had been known beforehand. It was only afterwards, which is why it was tough, because they suspected foul play. Paul and Rahul knew Curtis would not have just walked into the restaurant on his own and opened up a confrontation like that, especially such a heated one. But who would have pushed him to do something like this? Nelly would. And it was proven. Nelly had pushed Curtis to ask for a $5 raise. Maybe not directly. As you can tell by the text message up here, she advised that he says something. She told him, if you want more money, you should ask for it. You are a valuable member of the team. And, upon looking at that, you can't really say that there was any foul play. It's a completely justifiable thing to say, and especially because many of the back-of-house members would have agreed with her. He had been working there for a long time. He had stuck with the $21 an hour wage for quite some time. It was, a raise was well overdue. It was just the amount that he had asked for specifically that was a bit out of the question. But this didn't really help Paul and Rahul's case. Paula believed without a doubt that Nelly was behind this, and that she knew exactly what would happen if Curtis had walked out. But again, they had no evidence really to prove this. They could prove that Nelly pushed Curtis to ask for a raise, but did she tell him to have an outburst? No. Did she tell him to ask for $5 instead of $2? No. Did she tell him to leave because it would completely destroy the kitchen on a Saturday night? Absolutely not. She gave no signs of that whatsoever. So really, they had no evidence to back up their case. And especially with Allan being away, like I said earlier, there was no way to share these findings. And because Curtis never returned, there was no way of corroborating the story either. They had tried to get in contact with him. They had tried texting him, calling him, but to no avail. He completely left and essentially became the ghost. And he really was a person of interest at this time because he could have told them exactly what Nelly had maybe said outside of text messages. Because clearly, as we can tell, they had been talking about this before as well. They had a discussion about this issue outside of text messaging. So at some point when they were working, they also talked about this idea of him asking for a raise. So what was said there is a mystery. And that could have maybe given Paula and Will some grist in terms of, proving their suspicions of her. But they didn't even have that. Nelly actually addressed everything herself. She shared these text messages with the staff. She made it very apparent. She didn't try to hide anything. She, openly said, yes, I did have this discussion, but I did not tell him to do anything that was, done on Saturday night. And most people believed her because, again, she had those good relationships beforehand. And also, there was just no evidence to say otherwise. But then, Allan returned. Allan came back and, essentially said, we're not waiting for Allan to come back. We're not waiting for Curtis to come back. My apologies. We're just going to hire someone new. Which was a bit shocking because, yes, Curtis was, he had ghosted them for quite some time, but he was still looked at as a very valuable asset. And without him, again, there was no one to fill that hole that he had left in the kitchen. There was no one to keep Khalid and Jacob from talking. There was no one who could really do what he had done for the kitchen already. So yes, they were willing to excuse his absence. They were willing to, put all of that behind them and accept him back. But Allan, upon landing, he was very aggressive in his stance, and he actually wanted him fired. He wanted to look for a new replacement immediately. And so, with that news, with that kind of confirmation that yes, there will be an opening in back of house, and one that needs to be filled immediately, both Nelly and Paula kind of rushed in on the opportunity. Nelly, although she knows many servers, Darcy is also, a key producer of cooks in certain regards, so she knew some people as well, and Paula obviously knew people, and she wanted to make sure that she got dibs on this position. Front of house was one thing, but back of house, if she had anyone who was loyal to Nelly, it would upset the balance of her power entirely. So both Nelly and Paula were very, very keen on jumping on this opportunity. Simultaneously, Nelly and Paula submitted resumes, and it was only at this point that they became aware of the fact that Allan may have just been a bit jet-lagged, because a couple days later, in the manager group chat, he had, said this, and it became very apparent that, maybe he had misguessed or maybe he had made a misjudgment about Curtis, and he had been a little bit sleep-deprived when he had been approached about the issue. So he wasn't set on getting rid of Curtis just yet. It seemed that way. He had made it clear that he was, but in his travels and his exhaustion, he had said the wrong thing, apparently. So there really was no tactic to it. He was not trying to assert his dominance in any way. He was not trying to, set the record straight or, show the kitchen what happens when you go against him. He was really just tired and saying the wrong thing. We all make mistakes as people. We're human, and clearly this was one of those moments where he just was not thinking and he made a dumb move. But as a result of this dumb move, it inadvertently made Paula and Nelly's ambitions very clear. And because they both submitted resumes simultaneously, both of their hands were shown. And so now, back of house knew it was war. Front of house and back of house were going to clash. it was going to be either Nelly or Paula, and it was just going to be a matter of time. So, obviously there was a huge amount of tensions, and that just erupted into blatant attacks between front of house and back of house. Front of house would purposefully advise the guests to order certain dishes that were incredibly difficult to make in the kitchen. On certain cases, the serving staff would allow guests to enter 5 minutes before closing, just to keep the kitchen there a little bit longer past the time they're supposed to leave, which always irritated them. And in return, back of house would make orders wrong, give them to the wrong server so that they deliver the food to the wrong table, embarrassing them a little bit more. Calling for hands, making servers run across the restaurant to come pick up food, only to tell them we were just kidding. There were just these little skirmishes between the two sides. And there was clearly a very tangible animosity between the two sides. And finally, it took an open confrontation between front of house and back of house for someone to finally stand up and say, okay, I will take the position of general manager. And that person was Chris. Chris went up to Allan directly and said, I will take the job. And Allan, sensing the collapse of his company, decided, well, why not? And again, we spoke on Chris earlier. He was not a bad decision for general manager. He actually was a great candidate on paper. Again, he had plenty of experience. He had a good rapport, generally a good rapport on both sides. And he was well respected, especially amongst front of house staff. The same could not really be said for back of house. And again, this kind of came as a surprise because Nelly, after having her intentions kind of put on full display by Paula, again, it seemed sort of strange that she would not jump on the opportunity and just take the role of general manager, all things considered. But again, it sort of worked in the same way as it did before, because now Chris was the one who had all eyes on him instead of Nelly. And clearly this would lead to his eventual downfall as general manager. There were a few things leading up to his eventual demise that really just crippled his rule as general manager. One of them being the missed chit of the Christmas rush. This was completely detrimental on the night of Christmas Eve. There was a chit, a $300 chit for takeout that was misplaced, as Chris would say. He was on Expo, he was careless, he grabbed a chit which he thought had already gone through, threw it in the trash, and by the time the customers came up to pick up their $300 order, the dining room was already packed, and it was just a mess trying to get the order all put together, an order which never even went out because the customers, being so angry, walked out anyway. And that was really one of the most important events for Chris and his rule as general manager. That alone was enough to kind of turn people off of him as general manager. He was also just seen as a repeat of Reagan. The two of them were very close, so no one really trusted him for that regard. And he always chose the pacifist route. Now, originally this was kind of viewed as a strength. He was sort of neutral like Nelly. He really wanted to hear both sides of every story. But in this sort of role, especially with tensions being as high as they were between front of house and back of house, they needed someone to fight for the opinions of front of house, to really stand up against the blatant attacks from back of house. But they didn't get that. Instead, Chris was, quite apologetic. He tried to calm down front of house and tell them to not continue in what they were doing, to stop letting people in past closing, to stop deliberately sabotaging the kitchen and keeping them late and messing with their schedules. But in doing that, he never really did anything to enforce the same on back of house. Back of house continued to sabotage front of house and continued to mess with them in their own way. So the front of house immediately fell out of love with Chris, really. They saw him almost as a traitor, as a backstabber, because they were still being harassed by back of house, and he was doing nothing about it. Instead, he was only bombarding them with critiques and whatnot. And so, as a result, he lost favor with both front of house and back of house. He just was not ready for such a position. And similarly to Curtis, he did not show up for a Saturday night dinner rush. It's incredible that these coincidences just kept happening prior to the reign of Nelly, and it makes one wonder if she had any say in it whatsoever. But it's difficult because it makes you ask, how could she control something like that? How could she make someone walk out of their job on a Saturday night? Specifically on a Saturday night. One of the busiest night of the week for Burger Beast. How could this happen twice in the span of 2 months? Coincidence, maybe, but I've always wondered if maybe there was a connection there, if Nelly did have some hand in it, but we'll never really know for sure. All we know is that, again, Chris did not show up for his shift, and so they were down an extra pair of hands on front of house, and it just seemed very clear that they were about to suffer the exact same fate that they did on that other Saturday night just 2 months prior. They figured they were going to get slammed. Orders were going to come in at a pace that they were not prepared for, and the restaurant would be on the verge of closure, especially if it was going to be anything like the disaster that was that first Saturday night. But Nelly finally stepped in. Now, she was not officially the general manager, but by stepping in on this specific Saturday night, she kind of took on the role as a pseudo general manager or an interim general manager. And also, coincidentally, there's a lot of coincidences when we're talking about Nelly. Again, it makes me wonder how many of these coincidences are actually coincidences. But she also brought in Jordan Puck for a stage, another one of her friends from Darcy Art School, which meant that now she held the majority of influence in front of house, giving her the grounds to challenge back of house much easier, giving her numbers and strength in that regard. In desperation, not even Paula and Rahul attempted to sabotage her service because they knew they could not afford it. They'd already had an awful Saturday service only 2 months prior. They knew they could not have another one, so all they could do was follow her orders and do as she says. And it's incredible because this, if Hannibal Barca's masterpiece was the Battle of Cannae, this was Nelly's masterpiece. It was fully taking control of not only the kitchen, but her only competition, and doing it in a way so that they had to obey what she said. In a way, essentially giving her the authority that she needed, giving her the permission to become general manager. As I say here, Nelly had cemented herself in this way, not only as the new general manager, but the new face of Beastburger. She became this image and this figure that was akin to when Aaron was general manager, the one and only manager who ever knew both front of house and back of house. And this was obviously back when the walls were painted lime green. And now the pathway seemed open for her to follow in Aaron's footsteps and learn from their ways and master both sides of the restaurant. In effect, eliminating the divide between the kitchen and the serving staff. This was, in essence, the end of the rise of Nelly, as she would only go, a few steps further from here. But she had secured her general manager position, which is the position she had been gunning for a very long time. That does conclude this section of her journey. That doesn't mean that she is out of the woods yet. From this point forward, she still needs to pass the trials of Expo, as well as some other basic back-of-house knowledge, if she is to work in the kitchen, and we'll find out just how strenuous Paul and Rahul become in this essence. Obviously, they're not just going to let her walk right into the kitchen and have an easy time. Believe me, they put up a fight, but as we all know, it's in vain. Nelly will eventually become the powerful figure that she is today, and will eventually push forward the expansion of Burger Beast into territories that no one thought was possible. Remember to look at the reading that I've attached to this. Thank you all very much. Thank you.